The English countryside of Shropshire, calm and idyllic, has a way of masking even the darkest truths. Its rolling green pastures, quaint stone cottages, and narrow winding roads tell tales of peace and timeless tradition. And in the heart of this rural paradise stood Osbaston House, a sprawling mansion with manicured lawns, modern stables, luxury cars, and a sense of quiet superiority. It belonged to Christopher Foster, a self-made millionaire, and his beautiful family. To the public eye, Christopher had done everything right. He had built his fortune through ingenuity, an inventor who struck gold with a thermal insulation product used on oil rigs, a niche but lucrative business. He married Jill, a warm and refined woman admired for her grace and kindness. They had a daughter, Kirsty, the kind of teenager who lit up every room she entered. She rode horses competitively, excelled in school, and cherished every moment with her family. Together, they were the picture of success. And that picture is precisely what Christopher Foster wanted the world to see. It was Monday, August 25th, 2008, and the sun dipped lazily beneath the horizon as the family arrived home from a neighbor's barbecue. It had been a cheerful day, friends, the crack of clay pigeons exploding mid-air. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. If anything, Christopher had appeared particularly light-hearted. He laughed more than usual, patted shoulders, complimented the food. The kind of man you wouldn't guess carried the weight of something unspeakable. Back at the mansion, Jill moved through the house in her usual graceful rhythm, closing curtains and checking on the pets. Kirsty headed to her room to text her friends, excited about an upcoming riding event. Christopher, still in his casual outdoor attire, lingered downstairs. His eyes rested on the family photos that lined the hall: holidays in France, birthdays, Kirsty's horse shows, moments frozen in time. But Christopher saw something else. Not joy, not peace. He saw a house built on illusions, a life on the brink, and a man standing in the center of it all, surrounded by cracks. Behind the well-tended facade, Christopher Foster was a man in silent freefall. His business, Ulva Limited, had been liquidated. His bank accounts were suffocating under millions in debt. Legal threats loomed, and his once-flowing income had dried to a trickle. But rather than face the collapse, Christopher did what he always did. He hid it. From his friends, from his neighbors, from Jill, even from himself. He wasn't just losing his fortune. He was losing control. And for a man like Christopher, control was everything. Later that night, as Jill turned out the lights and Kirsty fell asleep to the soft hum of her iPod, Christopher walked through the house slowly, almost reverently. He checked the gates, the surveillance cameras, the horses in the stables, the vehicles in the garage. It was as if he were preparing the estate for something final. The quiet of the countryside wrapped around Osbaston House like a blanket. No one heard the creak of the floorboards. No one noticed the sudden stillness. The stars glittered above, indifferent. And then, darkness. The following morning, the village of Maesbrook was calm, as always. Neighbors went about their routines, feeding chickens, tending gardens, driving to town. No one suspected that anything was wrong at Osbaston House. Inside the mansion, the scent of coffee lingered in the kitchen. The chairs were pushed in neatly, the countertops spotless. But something was off. No movement, no clatter of dishes, no thump of teenage footsteps bounding down the stairs. Silence hung heavily in the air, pressing against the walls like fog. Christopher Foster hadn't slept that night. He hadn't slept well in weeks. He had spent the early hours of the morning sitting in his home office, surrounded by piles of unopened bills, solicitor letters, and court notices, many of which he had hidden from Jill. The walls were lined with certificates and awards, remnants of a man who had once believed he could conquer the world with an idea and a soldering iron. But now those walls felt like tombstones, each one marking the slow death of the life he built. The phone rang once. He let it go to voicemail. Another creditor, no doubt. The calls came often now. Banks, lawyers, tax collectors. He was running out of time, out of money, and out of ways to lie about it. Jill had started asking questions. Subtle at first. "Chris, why haven't we heard back from the accountants? Did you sign the papers for the horse's insurance renewal? I saw something strange from the bank." He always had answers. Half-truths, evasions, distractions. But he knew the clock was ticking. Jill wasn't just his wife. She was intelligent, intuitive, and grounded. She had spent the past 2 decades helping him look good, raising Kirsty, hosting elegant dinners, smoothing over Christopher's more impulsive moments. She was the steady hand behind the empire. And Kirsty. She was the light in their world. Sweet, quick-witted, full of teenage dreams. She loved horses, adored animals, and wanted to study veterinary medicine. She didn't know anything about insolvency or foreclosure. Her life was about ribbons, exams, and boys who made her blush. Christopher couldn't bear the thought of her finding out the truth, of them losing everything, of seeing his name in the tabloids as just another fallen tycoon. The shame would be unbearable, not just for him, but for them. And in his fractured logic, that was what scared him most. As the day dragged on, he busied himself with small tasks, pointless, obsessive things. Fixing a light bulb, straightening the garden hose, walking the dogs longer than usual, watching the security cameras. He called no one. He answered no one. He simply watched. By evening, Jill had grown uneasy. "You're acting strange today," she said gently as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm just tired," he replied. "Long week." She nodded, unconvinced. Dinner was quiet. Kirsty chatted about school, her upcoming horse show, a funny moment from a friend's text. Jill smiled, but Christopher barely touched his food. His eyes kept drifting to the hallway, the cameras, the clocks. He was thinking in sequences, timelines, logistics. After dinner, Jill and Kirsty went to bed early. Jill kissed him on the cheek and told him to come up soon. He said he would, but he didn't. He stayed downstairs, sitting in the dim glow of the living room, staring into the fireplace that wasn't lit. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The house was still. And then, slowly, he rose from his chair, moved to the garage, picked up tools he hadn't touched in years. He began blocking in the gates from the inside, ensuring no one could get in or out quickly. He disabled a few of the estate's vehicles, silently, methodically, like he had rehearsed it all. One by one, the final pieces clicked into place. He returned inside, moving softly through the hallway like a shadow in his own home. He passed by family photos again, Jill in her wedding dress, Kirsty on a pony, the 3 of them in Florida smiling under the sun. A beautiful lie, perfectly preserved in frames. In his mind, it was already over. The fall, the exposure, the disgrace. He had spent his whole life building walls to protect them from failure. Now, in his fractured reality, he believed there was only one way to protect them from what was coming. The estate was silent. The moon had risen, and something irreversible was about to begin. August 26, 2008. The final hours before dawn. The estate was completely still. A deep, unsettling silence filled every corner of Osbaston House, as if the building itself sensed what was coming. No footsteps, no voices, no flickering television, just the hum of surveillance monitors and the soft ticking of antique clocks echoing in the dark. Christopher Foster moved with a slow, eerie calm. He had made his way through the house earlier, removing light bulbs, disabling exterior lights, and setting up a small arsenal of tools, hammers, fuel cans, and a rifle. He had owned the gun for years. It was legal, rarely used. But that night, it was carefully polished, loaded, and placed within reach. In the stables, the horses stirred uneasily. The dogs barked once, then fell quiet. Outside, the wind barely moved. Not even nature seemed ready to intervene. At 1 a.m., Christopher stood at the top of the staircase, looking down into the foyer where moonlight painted faint shadows through the glass front doors. He breathed deeply, slowly, as if trying to absorb the moment fully. Then he turned toward the bedrooms. He walked softly into the master suite. Jill was fast asleep, her breathing calm and steady. She had never stopped believing in him, not even when the signs were obvious. That's who she was, loyal to a fault, trusting that the man she married could fix anything. He had tried, in his own twisted way, to see this as love, what he was doing. He had convinced himself it was a final act of protection, mercy. But at the core, it was fear, a dark, choking fear that had finally broken free. He raised the rifle. The silence that followed wasn't just absence. It was violence absorbed by soft linen, by the walls that had witnessed 20 years of family life. It was a kind of quiet that only comes after something irreversibly evil. He left the room. Kirsty's door was next. Her room was filled with posters of horses, photos of school friends, books she never got to finish. Her school uniform was folded neatly on the chair. Her mobile phone blinked once in the darkness, a message left unread. Christopher hesitated. This was his daughter, his little girl. She had been with him at business conferences as a toddler, proudly wearing her daddy's girl badge. She had danced in the living room on Christmas mornings, fed the horses in the cold, run to him when she fell. She was his pride. But in that moment, his heart and his mind had become two separate beings, one screaming in horror, the other moving like a machine. He entered the room. Minutes later, Christopher returned downstairs. His face was pale, empty. He did not cry. He did not hesitate anymore. He began the next phase. He moved to the garage and took the fuel cans, several of them. He splashed diesel and oil across the stables, the luxury cars, the garage itself. He entered the house again and did the same, soaking the entryway, the walls, the floors, even the base of the staircase. He lit the first match just after 3 a.m. Within seconds, flames consumed the wooden beams above the stables. Horses neighed in terror, their frantic cries piercing the night. The dogs barked wildly. The fire spread with eerie speed, moving like it knew the way. He walked back inside through the rising smoke. The CCTV system continued recording, capturing him in motion, walking through the halls as fire licked the edges of the mansion. He made no effort to flee. He stood at the center of it all, watching the world he built unravel in firelight. Neighbors didn't notice anything at first. It wasn't until around 4 a.m. that a thick column of black smoke rose above the trees. A passing motorist saw the glow and called emergency services. Firefighters arrived as the roof began to collapse. They couldn't get through the gates. Vehicles were blocked. Every route had been sealed. By then, the mansion was an inferno. It would be another 2 days before the truth emerged from the ashes. August 26, 2008, 4:15 a.m. When the first fire engine arrived at Osbaston House, the sky was still dark, tinted orange by the towering flames. It was not just a house fire. It was an eruption. The heat was so intense that firefighters had to keep a distance. Smoke billowed across the fields like storm clouds. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and prestige, was crumbling before their eyes. They could hear animals, horses screaming, dogs yelping. But there was nothing they could do. Every point of entry, had been intentionally blocked. Heavy farm equipment had been positioned at the gates. Vehicles had been disabled, chains, locks, barriers. Christopher Foster had made sure that no one could get in or out. Neighbors stood outside their homes in robes and coats, watching in disbelief as the mansion was consumed. Some of them had been with the Fosters just hours earlier, sharing drinks and laughter at the barbecue. Now, that same family estate was disappearing into smoke. One neighbor whispered, "Where's Jill? Where's Kirsty?" No one had seen them. It took 24 hours for firefighters to bring the blaze under control. But even then, the structure was unstable. The roof had collapsed. Entire sections of the home had caved in. The stables were gone. The garage was a melted carcass of twisted steel and charred luxury cars. The damage was so severe, investigators weren't even sure what they were looking at. Was this a tragic accident or something else? On August 27th, a forensic team entered what was left of the mansion. Inside the main hallway, they found something deeply unsettling. Lined up neatly along the walls were the bodies of the family's animals. The dogs, all shot. The horses in the stable had not escaped either. Many had suffered the same fate. It wasn't just fire that had taken lives here. It was intent. Cold, organized, systematic. Forensic officers moved through the wreckage inch by inch, dusting ashes, checking structural stability, documenting every clue. The air was thick with soot and dread. Beneath what remained of the master bedroom, they discovered a body, badly burned, but still distinguishable as a female. Nearby, another body was found, a young girl, believed to be around 15. Both had been killed before the fire, shot while sleeping. There were no signs of struggle. And finally, in the remains of the garage, underneath the wreckage of a fallen beam, they found a third body, male, adult. Also deceased before the fire reached its peak. A rifle lay nearby. Dental records confirmed what everyone had feared. The bodies were Jill, Kirsty, and Christopher Foster. The news broke across the UK the next morning. Millionaire family found dead in Shropshire mansion fire. Father may be linked to tragic deaths, investigators say. Financial ruin behind family slaying? The headlines couldn't capture the horror. They couldn't explain how a man who smiled over a barbecue could then walk through his house extinguishing every life he loved. The community was stunned. People who had called Christopher a friend suddenly questioned everything they thought they knew. A neighbor told reporters, "He was always proud. Never showed weakness. I didn't even know he was struggling." None of us did. But behind the scenes, investigators were beginning to understand what Christopher had hidden. Documents surfaced. Financial records, court letters, notices of liquidation. The pressure had been building for years. Millions of pounds in debt, lawsuits over unpaid loans, business failures swept under the rug. His empire had been collapsing silently. And then there was the CCTV footage. Recovered from the estate's private security system, the footage showed Christopher walking through the house after his family had gone to bed. Calm, deliberate. He was seen carrying fuel cans, seen blocking vehicles, seen preparing everything for what was to come. There was no panic, no confusion, only order. A suicide note was never found. No final confession. But the truth didn't need words. This wasn't a man who snapped. This was a man who planned. And for many, that was the most terrifying part. By the end of August 2008, Osbaston House was no longer a home. It was a graveyard. A smoldering skeleton of bricks and soot. A shell that once held laughter, comfort, and love, now studied by investigators like an autopsy. But the real investigation, the one the world cared about, was not of a house, but of a man. Who was Christopher Foster? Why would a man so devoted to his family turn his home into a tomb? The press didn't wait for answers. Headlines flooded in, each one more sensational than the last. Millionaire's Mansion Massacre. Success, secrets, and slaughter. He killed to protect them or to destroy them? Psychologists, financial analysts, former business partners all stepped forward with theories. His finances had been deteriorating for years. His business, Ulva Limited, which once made him a millionaire, had failed. His assets were tied up in court battles. His debts were massive. He had sold off property, pawned his future, and was on the verge of losing everything. But here was the contradiction. Christopher didn't act like a desperate man. Not publicly. He had spent the last few months pretending everything was fine. He took his family on vacation. He invested in home renovations. He bought new tech for the stables. He even attended events with his usual air of success. It was all illusion. He wasn't trying to fix the fall. He was trying to hide it. From everyone. And in that act of deception, experts saw the seed of something darker. Christopher Foster was a man who equated financial failure with personal annihilation. One forensic psychologist said, he didn't see bankruptcy as a chapter. He saw it as the end of his story and, tragically, his family's. But others weren't so forgiving. Many began to ask, was this really about protection, or was it about control? Control was something Christopher had always demanded. In business, in his image, in how people saw him. The family photos were always perfect. The house was always pristine. His wife always smiled. His daughter always excelled. It was a curated life. And when it began to unravel, he didn't just fear humiliation. He feared exposure. To people like him, exposure was death. Those closest to Jill Foster struggled with that narrative. She had friends, extended family, people who loved her deeply. Many couldn't believe she knew nothing about their financial state. But there were no indications she had expected this. No cries for help. No calls to lawyers or therapists. No protective moves made in advance. Kirsty's friends were devastated. She had texted several of them the night she died, talking about school and her horse, bouncing between jokes and emojis. She had been planning to attend a friend's birthday party that weekend. She had dreams, teenage anxieties, playlists filled with upbeat pop music. No part of her knew what was coming. Her school held a memorial. Her riding stable held a candlelight vigil. Everyone who attended wondered the same thing. Why? The coroner's inquest began weeks later. It confirmed what everyone already knew, that Christopher had committed a double murder-suicide, that he had planned it methodically, that the motive was deeply entangled in financial ruin and psychological breakdown. The word used again and again was protection. But it didn't sit right. Jill and Kirsty didn't need protection from poverty. They needed protection from Christopher. And he had become the very thing they needed protecting from. For those who knew him best, this was the most painful truth. Christopher Foster loved his family, but only so long as he could keep them in the world he had built. Once that world began to collapse, he chose to destroy it entirely, rather than let them live outside of it. A former colleague put it bluntly, he couldn't bear to lose face. Not even for them. That was the paradox. The man who killed his family believed he was saving them. But in truth, he was saving himself from having to watch them live without him. Months passed. The ash and smoke had long cleared from the grounds of Osbaston House. The estate, once a sprawling symbol of wealth and ambition, now sat fenced off, abandoned and silent. Scorched earth, collapsed walls, the ruins of a family. But the questions never truly stopped. In the nearby villages, people still whispered about the Fosters, at pubs, at post offices, in hushed conversations behind closed doors. Neighbors who had once envied their lifestyle now only spoke of tragedy. The memory of Jill's gentle smile, Kirsty's vibrant energy, and even Christopher's confident stride now carried a weight that time couldn't quite erase. There were no survivors, no one left to explain the why. But in the wake of destruction, there were still voices, those who pieced together the fragments and tried to find meaning in a senseless act. Jill's sister spoke to reporters months after the inquest. He didn't snap. He planned it. And that's what I'll never understand. Why not walk away? Why not let us help her? Help Kirsty? If he couldn't live with failure, fine. But why take them too? Her words echoed the pain of thousands who read about the case, unable to reconcile the man who smiled over barbecues with the man who blocked escape routes and shot his own family. Psychologists would later use Christopher Foster as a case study, an example of what's known as familicide driven by narcissistic collapse. It is rare, but devastating, a phenomenon where the head of a household, often male, faces a loss of status or identity so severe that they view death, for themselves and their family, as the only way to preserve dignity, to retain control, to protect loved ones from a perceived shameful fall. But these are clinical terms. They do nothing to explain what it felt like for Jill in her final moments, or for Kirsty, who died without warning, without a goodbye. For the community, grief turned to reflection. Churches held services not just for the Fosters, but for families struggling in silence. Counselors spoke to students at Kirsty's school about mental health and the importance of speaking up. Neighbors began checking in on one another a little more often. For a time, the story was national news. Then, slowly, it faded, replaced by other headlines, other tragedies. But in Shropshire, the wound remained, and so did the lessons. Because Christopher Foster did not live in isolation. He lived among friends, among people who admired him, people who saw the signs, but didn't understand what they meant. The expensive spending, the withdrawn behavior, the strange late-night movements, the evasive answers. They were brushed off, rationalized. After all, how could something so terrible happen behind such beautiful gates? The truth is, the illusion was too perfect. And that may be the greatest warning of all, because the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. That wealth means happiness, that success means security, that the absence of visible pain means someone is fine. But behind closed doors, people break in silence. Christopher Foster didn't just take lives. He left behind a question that still haunts everyone who knew him. What would have changed if someone had asked, truly asked, how he was doing, and waited long enough to hear the real answer?